In the aftermath of the Versailles Treaty, the Germans faced significant limitations being placed on both the number and size of all warship types that the Allied powers could think about as relevant that the Germans were allowed to operate. Therefore, in the 1920s, the then Reichsmarine decided to start experimenting with types which weren't covered by the treaty. Taking some inspiration from Italian Mars boats and British coastal motor torpedo boats, to name but a few, it was decided that a fleet of fast, cheap, torpedo-armed motorboats would be the ideal weapon to swarm a larger enemy fleet, at least at closer ranges like the English Channel or the southern North Sea. Initially labelling the program as a submarine chaser to disguise its more offensive role, the search was then on for a suitable high-speed hull. The problem was that most speedboats of the time used what was known as a planing hull, a relatively short hull with a flat or mostly flat underside, and the type could usually be seen tearing around lakes and rivers, sometimes with its bow pointed upward to the skies. But there were two problems with this type. Firstly, the shallow nature of the propeller made for a huge rooster tail of water, which advertised your presence to anyone with a functioning set of eyes, and secondly, if you took a boat of this kind at speed out at sea, large waves hitting the underside of the hull tended to stop any further advance about as effectively as a good solid punch to the midriff stops a sprinter. But, as the 1920s drew to a close, the German boat maker Lürssen built a private yacht named the Oheka II. This used metal framework but a wooden shell to reduce weight. It had a rounded underside that better pushed water away and was therefore more suited to a wave-heavy environment. It had a flattened stern section, and the engines were moved amidships, which made the craft slightly nose-heavy at low speeds, but helped to stop the entire hull climbing at too steep an angle when it was running at high speeds. With 1,650 brake horsepower from 3 V12 engines, the craft could reach about 34 knots. Pretty soon, an officer showed up at Lürssen with an order that was essentially that, but a little bit bigger and armed with torpedoes, specifically a pair of torpedo tubes stuck on the bow. Using no less than 2,700 brake horsepower, the larger and more heavily loaded S1 was able to maintain the 34-knot top speed of the yacht design. The designation of S was because of the German term for the entire type, Schnellboote, or fast boats. A series of small batch orders were made for ever larger versions in the early 1930s. However, by the mid to late 1930s, the design had advanced both in size and sophistication so much that the first boats, S1 and S2 through 6, were sold along with a number of export model derivations, and those numbers would later end up being reused in the latter part of the decade with newer craft. By the time of the S18 class, a number of innovations had been introduced via testing and were combined into a single craft. There was a more buoyant bow, which had prevented a tendency of earlier boats to nosedive after cresting a large wave. Two small angled rudders were included, which created what was termed the Lürssen effect, in which redirected water flow lifted the stern, thus reducing drag, and it also created a low-pressure air pocket behind the propellers, which increased the efficiency of the propulsion system. The final underwater innovation was relatively simple, a wedge-shaped deflector mounted under the stern that also sent some of the water that was flowing past downwards, further lifting the rear hull. This all combined to allow subsequent S-boats to travel at great speed with a near-horizontal attitude. By 1938, two subclasses were ordered, the S26 and S30 types, with the S26s being a little bit larger due to using MB501 diesels, and the S30s therefore being a little bit smaller, using MB502 diesels. These craft had a total of 6,000 brake horsepower at their disposal, which allowed for a top speed that was somewhere just above or below 40 knots, depending on the exact boat, the sea conditions, and a variety of other factors, with the S30 type usually being a fraction faster. They also introduced a higher forecastle as well as torpedo tubes integrated into the hull, and they would become the definitive designs for Schnellboote production. Almost all S-boats built subsequently in any significant numbers were either copies of or slight derivations of these two models, with the S-26 type being the more common. Initial gun armament consisted of a couple of 20mm cannon, with the possibility of adding an additional 20mm cannon and or 37mm on some boats. As war production went on, gun armament would increase slightly, but the need for the hull to be carefully balanced and to maintain its speed meant that compared to their most common opponents, British large Fairmile MGBs and MTBs, that's motor gunboat and motor torpedo boat respectively, the S-boats were usually heavily outgunned, but considerably faster, while smaller Vosper-type motor torpedo boats could match them for speed. They only carried a similar level of firepower, at least at first. The Allies generally referred to S-boats as E-boats, which many at the time claimed simply stood for enemy boat. Thus, most of the changes made to S-boat design subsequently tended to focus on being able to maintain the craft's speed and agility, while adding some defensive measures to allow the crew to get away safely if attacked. This included things like an armour-plated shield mounted over the bridge. A number of increasingly esoteric experiments were also done during the war to look into new ways to power the craft at speed, including hydrofoils and rocket propulsion. Luckily, this was not tried on the same boat. In addition, smaller derivatives used for mine-laying or even as onboard attack craft aboard Hilfskreuzer would also see small production runs. Most of the S-boat's action was seen in the North Sea and the English Channel, where there were many engagements fought against similar-sized Allied attack craft as the Germans tried to attack convoys, small escort ships, and later on, Allied landing craft and troop transports. There were also some significant operations mounted in the Baltic against the Soviets, and small contingents were also transported overland to the Black and Mediterranean Seas. Post-war, some surviving S-boats would be used by the Danish and Norwegian navies in regular service, and the Royal Navy would use a few for special operations against the Soviets during the Cold War, with one of these Royal Navy-operated craft, S-130, being the only known survivor, currently being restored by the Wheatcroft collection.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.